but at least she comes across here as professional in what she's saying, and she seems to think a deal is coming. And let's be real. Regardless of how tough Collier wants to talk, we're not going to cave in. Well, if you want to play basketball in the WNBA, you're going to have to. Because they're going to shut the league down if you don't. They're not giving you 30% revenue or whatever in the hell that ridiculousness is.
Lit gym with very ambitious branding, a bold experiment is happening where people are being confidently told they are witnessing a cultural revolution, even though the remote control remains untouched. The plan sounds simple. Take the Caitlin Clark effect, copy it, paste it onto Paige Bueckers, and wait for the ratings to explode. What actually happened is far more confusing, unintentionally hilarious, and impossible to ignore. Wait for it.
In its final days, as Paige Bueckers and gang could not save the viewership from tanking. What does this mean for the WNBA when they make their return back to TV? There has been news to come out about Unrivaled viewership being down nearly 70% from last year. Now, I'm going to tell y'all why this is bad. Because last year, it wasn't like they was cracking hella views to begin with. They wasn't even getting hella views at all last year. Now, this year, their views is down by nearly 7%.
Once again, standing in the middle of a self-created storm, staring confidently into the camera while insisting the weather is actually great and the rain is part of the experience.
That you're sitting in front of everybody, in front of all these fans and saying, we don't want raises. They're at 9 times what, by the end of the next CBA, it would literally be a 9 times salary increase. You're telling people you don't want that. You got to be kidding me, right? It's not a good look. After complaining about, because for years, all we heard about was money. So after years of complaining about money, now it's not about money anymore. You want it to be about revenue.
Rooms, half-empty arenas, and very optimistic press releases. The idea has taken hold that all problems can be solved by declaring a new superstar into existence and hoping the audience politely plays along.
Towards the end of the season, we start seeing the WNBA kind of fudge the numbers, taking into account group party watch party viewerships, counting those into, effect like bars and stuff like that. Now, with that being said, that metric kind of lied about the numbers allegedly being what they was to close out the WNBA season. Now we're getting data from the Unrivaled pretty much claiming that their number
experiment involves attempting to bottle the lightning that came with Caitlin Clark, slap a new label on it, and sell it as Paige Bueckers, only without the inconvenient part where millions of people actually show up to watch.
So I got to talk about Paige Bueckers. And no, I'm not talking about Paige Bueckers because people are talking about Candace Parker talking about Paige Bueckers. I was really harping on Paige Bueckers Monday night during Unrivaled, her debut with Unrivaled, her team, what are they called again? The Breeze. It's a new team. The Breeze taking on the Phantom. I didn't realize how much of a ball hog Paige Bueckers.
Strategy appears to be simple in theory and baffling in execution. At no point does the plan appear to include the radical idea of letting organic interest develop naturally, because that would require patience, humility, and a willingness to accept that not every star shines the same way. While labor negotiations hover in the background like an unresolved group project nobody prepared for, the league's public messaging has taken on the tone of forced optimism mixed with mild panic. One side of the conversation insists everything is close to being resolved, that progress is happening quietly, and that professionalism will eventually save the day. The other side seems far more interested in airing every frustration publicly, ensuring that any goodwill evaporates before it has time to exist. In the middle of this mess stands a league desperately trying to sell hope while still negotiating the basic mechanics of survival.
Well, Caitlin, of course, we go way back, Midwestern. We had a lot of battles in AAU and stuff like that. We played together on Team USA. I think she's just a competitor. She wants to win. She has just intangibles of the game. She knows how to play, great IQ. But I think the biggest thing about her is she competes, and she's just a winner. She wants to win at all costs. And so I know going into that, it'll be a great matchup. But I'm excited. It's great for the game.
Nationalism has become the new buzzword, mostly because it is easier said than practiced. Some players speak as though they understand that public negotiations require restraint, careful wording, and a recognition that emotions rarely close deals. Others appear committed to turning every disagreement into a public spectacle, as if venting online somehow strengthens their bargaining position. The result is a negotiation process that feels less like a serious business discussion and more like a reality show subplot nobody asked for. Amid this chaos, the notion that players who are deeply invested in a rival league should also influence collective bargaining decisions raises eyebrows that were already permanently lifted. Conflicts of interest are brushed aside with vague assurances about shared goals and equity stakes, as if saying the words makes the problem vanish. It is a fascinating experiment in logic, suggesting that ownership, leadership, and labor can all occupy the same space without friction, provided everyone agrees not to acknowledge the obvious tension. Yet none of this would matter nearly as much if the product itself commanded attention. Instead, attention is being demanded rather than earned. The new league, proudly marketed as innovative and culture-forward, looks and feels like an experiment still searching for its purpose.
A ball hog. And we got into it in the chat. And I know there's some Paige Bueckers loyalists out there who are going to say, not you piling on Paige Bueckers. What do you mean? She's a ball. She's a ball. She was playing 1-on-3 in that game on Monday night. So yes, I know she scored 24 points. I expect her to score 24 points because she didn't want to pass the ball. Now, you might say, well, Adrian, she had 6 assists.
Named as revolutionary. The atmosphere is described as electric, and the players are declared icons, all while viewers quietly ask themselves why the screen looks dimmer than their living room, and why the action feels more like an extended scrimmage than must-watch entertainment. Into this environment steps Paige Bueckers, not as a player allowed to grow into her professional identity, but as a symbol tasked with carrying the weight of an entire league's aspirations. She is presented not merely as talented, but as transformative, as if her presence alone should alter the gravitational pull of women's basketball. Caitlin Clark did not become a phenomenon because executives declared her one. She became a phenomenon because fans responded organically to her style, her moments, and her ability to generate excitement that translated effortlessly to television. Attempting to replicate that effect through sheer insistence misunderstands what made it special in the first place.
So the first set of Unrivaled ratings are in, and it's been kind of grim. And by kind of grim, I mean really, really grim. If you are Unrivaled, this is, if these are your ratings every single week on True TV, it's not the biggest disaster in the world, because by the looks of things, these True TV ratings were similar enough to what they were a year ago.
Leadership speaks of culture as though it were a substitute for competition, as if fans tune in primarily to admire vibes rather than baskets. Culture is framed as the central selling point, which is a curious choice when the actual basketball is treated as secondary. The implication seems to be that viewers should care deeply about identity, messaging, and symbolism, even if they struggle to remember team names or game results the following day. Games are described with enthusiasm that suggests historic significance, yet they pass by with barely a ripple in the broader sports conversation. A high-scoring performance is celebrated internally as validation of the league's vision, even as the external audience remains largely unaware it happened. The same tactics have been used before, with the same predictable result of skepticism from anyone paying attention. Announcing percentage increases without explaining the baseline is not transparency, but it is very on-brand.
It's going around on the internet, and it doesn't look good at all. But I do want to tell you guys that this isn't the final number. All right, this is just, I believe, a certain age group. I think it's like 18 to 49. And they didn't necessarily count everybody who was watching on HBO Max, all that good stuff. I think it will finish around 200,000, 190,000 like it did last year. I don't think it'll be an increase like that, although they did add a good amount of new players.
An almost poetic confidence in suggesting partnerships with established leagues while simultaneously struggling to demonstrate independent viability. Invitations are extended as though leverage exists, as though the offer is a gift rather than a request. It is optimism bordering on fantasy, fueled by the belief that alignment alone can solve structural issues that remain unresolved. Meanwhile, arenas remain modest, attendance remains selective, and the biggest crowds still coincide with the arrival of a particular team from Indiana. It is not an indictment of her talent, but a critique of the expectation placed upon her. Stars cannot manufacture interest in a vacuum, and no amount of branding can replace the unpredictable alchemy between player and audience.
Unrivaled is sustainable, they say. They say. Ratings have come out for Unrivaled, and folks, if I was to say fall off a cliff, if I was to say significant drop-off, I would be underselling how underperforming day one of Unrivaled really was. Remember during the WNBA season? Oh my gosh, all the ratings, the record ratings, blah.
The entire situation is further complicated by the perception of a tightly knit ecosystem that promotes its own while marginalizing outsiders. Certain programs, narratives, and alumni seem to circulate endlessly through leadership roles, media praise, and symbolic elevation. The result is a feedback loop where familiarity is mistaken for dominance and internal validation is confused with universal appeal. The broader sports audience is not obligated to care simply because it is told to do so. Interest is not a moral duty, and viewership is not a favor fans owe to a league. It is earned through compelling competition, accessible storytelling, and moments that feel authentic rather than orchestrated. Declaring greatness is easy, but sustaining attention is far harder. As deadlines approach and negotiations drag on, the league's messaging oscillates between calm reassurance and subtle urgency. Confidence is projected outward, while internal tensions remain unresolved. Expansion drafts and free agency loom, creating a sense of urgency that contrasts sharply with the leisurely pace of progress. The disconnect between timelines and readiness raises questions that optimism alone cannot answer. At its core, the attempt to give Paige Bueckers the Caitlin Clark effect reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how stars are made and how audiences engage. Growth requires patience, honesty, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable realities rather than rebranding them as culture.
The fact that the Rose and Lunar Owls on the primetime slot on TNT had, I don't think this is 40,000 viewers, because I think this is the NA is the actual viewer. I think this is like the ratings numbers. I think this is in and around 100,000 viewers, which isn't good. Last year it was, am I right in saying last year at 1.0? No, last year was 0.1.
The spectacle continues, complete with grand declarations, carefully framed optimism, and the persistent hope that this time the audience will respond simply because it has been asked to. The popcorn remains untouched, the beverage grows warm, and the promise of nonstop action echoes through a space that feels far quieter than advertised. And the quiet is the part nobody wants to acknowledge, because silence is far harder to spin than disappointment. Silence does not trend, it does not inflate percentages, and it does not magically turn culture into currency. Silence simply sits there, reminding everyone that excitement cannot be negotiated into existence, and fandom cannot be guilted into showing up. You can rename the product, redesign the graphics, dim the lights to create ambiance, and speak passionately about vision, but silence remains stubbornly unimpressed. This strategy conveniently absolves leadership of responsibility while gently scolding the public for not being enlightened enough.
Time window of games. The 8 o'clock game and the 9:15 game, or the 9:30 game, whatever heck time it was. 175,000 viewers. The afternoon window averaged 107,000 viewers. All that, if you're a 90s baby, you know. All that is down from 208,000 average viewership during regular season games in Unrivaled year.
That the Caitlin Clark effect was never mysterious or complicated. It involved visible competitiveness, moments that felt unscripted, and a player who appeared to thrive under pressure rather than branding. The excitement followed the action, not the other way around. Trying to reverse engineer that formula by emphasizing symbolism over substance feels like mistaking the packaging for the product. There's also something deeply uncomfortable about watching a young star be elevated into a marketing shield, positioned as proof of concept rather than allowed to simply play. Every strong performance is immediately framed as validation of a business model, while every quiet night is quietly ignored. The player becomes less of an athlete and more of a talking point, which is rarely fair and rarely sustainable. Meanwhile, the league's internal contradictions continue to pile up. Revenue sharing is demanded before consistent revenue exists. Expansion is discussed while foundational structures remain shaky. They notice when the loudest voices belong to people explaining why something matters instead of people reacting because it does. They notice when the conversation around basketball spends more time justifying itself than celebrating the game.
Right? But in basketball, you have men and women. As you see in this graph, you have Caitlin Clark, Cooper Flagg, Victor Wembanyama, LeBron James, and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, right? So the fact that you have men and women and seeing how the men's basketball league is flourishing, right, has way more people watching than the WNBA right now. You have Caitlin Clark dominating the map.
Continued push to manufacture urgency only amplifies the disconnect. Deadlines are framed as dramatic turning points, yet their outcomes rarely alter the viewing experience. Negotiations are portrayed as existential battles, but the resolution, when it arrives, tends to feel administrative rather than transformative. The spectacle exists almost entirely in press conferences and interviews, while the court remains strangely secondary. What ultimately makes this attempt so fascinating is not that it is failing, but that it refuses to admit the possibility. Every sign of indifference is reframed as potential energy. Every lukewarm response is labeled a stepping stone. And every comparison to Caitlin Clark is treated as inevitable rather than aspirational. The league speaks as though destiny is on its side, even as evidence suggests destiny might be busy elsewhere. If this experiment teaches anything, it is that Lightning does not care about branding decks or strategic narratives. It strikes where it strikes, and the crowd either feels it or does not. Until that reality is accepted, the effort to recreate the Caitlin Clark effect will continue to look less like innovation and more like a very confident misunderstanding, delivered with a straight face to an audience that keeps waiting for the punchline.